There is no independent, observable, identifiable, separate self in there. It's just a bunch of ideas, but built upon flawed memories and flawed ideas. And most people don't take the time to begin to understand their mind and to redesign it.
I think we all need to inquire into our own individual idiosyncratic ideals to really figure out what we value uniquely and how we can learn to embody them.
If you met an alien who had a completely different perspective on reality and didn't have an understanding about human values, which ones would you defend and how would you do that?
That's a great question.
So welcome to the Mark Divine Show, where the journey to greatness begins with this listen. Brian, so great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the trek from North Carolina, you say?
Yeah. A little mountain town outside of North Carolina.
What's the name of that town?
It's Brevard.
Brevard?
Brevard, yeah.
Okay. Population?
Very small. I don't know exactly, but...
The reason I asked, I'm from a small town in upstate New York, and I never thought about it until a sarcastic friend of mine Googled it, and he started laughing out loud. He was like, oh my God, Barneveld, New York, huh?
Yeah.
Population 375 people.
Okay, we've got thousands for sure, but probably not more than 10,000.
Okay, that's a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
You grew up there?
No, actually. I grew up in suburbs of Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Not a stereotypical Southerner, but that's where I grew up. And then I ended up in Brevard about 7 years ago for a design job, and I've stayed there ever since.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about those years in Memphis. What were those years? What were some of the formative things that shaped your reality back then?
Yeah, so a big part of what has led me here is just a really deep innate fascination with my own mind in particular. Since I was a teenager, when I probably should have been paying attention to socializing or whatever else, I was just kind of immersed in my own mind. I was fascinated by introspection and by particularly the act of changing and designing my own mental reactions, cognitive biases, habits, emotional reactions in particular.
Do you have any understanding as to why you were that way?
I've thought about that a lot. I think, my parents, especially my mom, are kind of inclined that way. My mom has a psychology background, and I think she raised us in a very sort of thoughtful, curious kind of way. A lot of genetics too. My grandfather is like was kind of a clone of me, essentially. So.
Or you were a clone of him, you mean?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Toward the end of his life, I had some conversations where I realized, oh wow, we're interested in the same things, even though we never talked about it until now. So, really interesting how that works.
So what's the earliest age where you kind of had this awareness that you're really interested in the mind and its construct?
Probably the 13 to 15 range.
Okay.
I started going on long walks and just reflecting on philosophical ideas. And, I would be in school and we'd get some, homework over the weekend or something. And I started saying, how can I flip this around so that I have a positive emotional reaction to it instead of a negative one? I started just tinkering with my own mind and learning, oh, wow, you can do some really cool things. You can change the way you experience the world. And I started taking notes before I even started reading books. At that age, I still thought learning was boring and books were boring. But eventually that led to reading a lot of psychological research, a lot of ancient philosophy. As soon as I discovered all that, and I got into Stoicism and Buddhism and stuff, there was kind of no looking back. But yeah, and then also around that age, I, when I was in 7th grade, I went into real school. I'd been homeschooled and had a Montessori school and a lot of self-education stuff. So I went into real school for the first time, and it was kind of a shock socially. I realized I wasn't really proud of the person I was at that age. Most people, I imagine, aren't in 7th grade, but I was scared of the world, and I didn't know how to really interact with people, and that led me ultimately to do something crazy for someone like me, who's kind of a chess team type of kid, and join the football team at, 100-pound kid who didn't talk. And I think I did it because I knew I needed to get way out of my comfort zone in order to grow. That was a huge leap out of my comfort zone, but I credit it for a lot of growth and a lot of really what led me to my ideas now.
To do that at that age. And most people never do that.
Yeah, no, I'm amazed at 13 that I had the forethought. I know I couldn't have articulated really why I was doing it, but I just said I need to do this, and then I stayed on the team that whole year, and then 4 more years, and I wasn't ever good at it.
That's funny.
I use the term played loosely, but it caused me to grow in so many ways in terms of my mindset and social skills, everything.
So did you go on to college?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I went into product design, industrial design was the degree. I was looking into a lot of things. Computer science I was very interested in, obviously psychology, philosophy stuff. But ultimately I decided that's too far on the analytical extreme and not enough creativity. I really thrive on a blend of creativity and analytical. And so I discovered product design and said, this is kind of perfect. This is a lot of creative problem solving. And I still think it really was perfect. I can't imagine a better way to sort of start my venture into this stuff than studying design principles. Worked in that, field for a little while, did everything from the 9-to-5 job to consulting and co-founding startups and stuff. Then I decided it's sort of time to take the leap into this space. I had more notes than my note-taking app could even handle without crashing, and I had more than a book's worth of information that I was just kind of ready to get out there. So I took a 60% pay cut at the job I had at the time, went to 2 days a week so that I could spend the other 3 writing this book, Designing the Mind. And that's what kicked it off, published it in 2021, and I've been doing lots more of that ever since, and it's become my full-time thing, essentially.
So what did you learn from product design that you have applied to designing the mind? I mean, how do the two kind of mesh?
Well, it's product design, and also when I was looking into computer science, there's a lot of that has been blended in too. But essentially looking at the mind as this machine that, has been initially designed and sort of shaped by natural selection, and realizing that we're kind of able to uniquely design and program our own psychological operating system. And so the basic principles of creative problem solving and the design process of looking at, the mind as a set of systems, trying to understand those systems and find the leverage points for creating change, looking at individual, I like to say, psychological algorithms, how they work and how you can go in and rewire them so that you have a different mental, emotional experience. I think all of those things in my background kind of blended together. And then obviously there's the component of just getting to design the physical products, and the branding and everything has been really a ton of fun with Designing the Mind. So,
hi, Mark Devine here from SealFit. After 2 years of development, I'm super stoked to announce the launch of SealFit supplements and our first product, SealFit Electro Greens. This is the highest quality organic greens you can find, combined with electrolytes into one powerful supplement. Take with 8 ounces of water in the morning, or add to your smoothie to get your day kicked off right with the proper nutritional supplementation and hydration support. And you can also use it as a pick-me-up booster during the day or after a workout. It dissolves immediately, and believe it or not, it tastes great. I've had many testimonials already saying it's the best tasting greens that they have ever tried. So hoo-yah, SealFitSupplements.com, or you can find it on Amazon by searching for SealFit Electro Greens. Hoo-yah. Let's do this. Divine out. That is delicious. From your perspective, and I know you use the term psychitecture, which sounds like architecting the psychology, which makes sense. How is it different than therapy?
Yeah.
Or traditional psychology, which is basically deconstructing stories, and a story is an algorithm.
Yeah.
And reconstructing them, to be more favorable for life circumstances.
Sure. I like to compare psychotherapy to physical therapy, in that's great that we have that for when you have an injury, an illness, when you need to really work one-on-one with someone to make sure you go through the healing process. But with the physical space, we also have fitness, yoga, CrossFit. We have this thing that you do to get stronger when you're not necessarily injured or ill, that people kind of turn into a hobby, an obsession. There's a community around it. It's kind of a fun, exciting thing, and kind of a DIY thing in a way, rather than this very sterile clinical thing. And so I've kind of been asking for years now, where is that cool community space for designing the mind that we kind of have for designing our bodies and building strength? And so that has led me to create a lot of this stuff and create my Psychitecture community called Mindform that in some ways is kind of like a fitness community for the mind, where people can gather and study the ancient philosophical principles and the modern psychological research to get stronger psychologically, to get better and healthier. And it's kind of a fun, exciting thing rather than, this kind of sterile, stuffy thing that we learn about in psychology and psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. That makes sense. So, in any kind of design process, you have to have an end state in mind.
Yeah.
Or kind of at least loosely understood where you're heading. How do you define that end state? What's the ideal? Like, what's the ideal mind look, act like? What should we be striving for?
Yeah, there are a few different angles, I think, that we can look at that from. One of them that I really like doing is looking at the ideals that have been presented throughout philosophical history. As early as, the Buddha and the Stoics and, Socrates, we've had this ideal of the sage or the Buddha, the Bodhisattva. And then we've got things like Nietzsche's Overman and Maslow's self-actualizing individual. We've got a lot of ideals that have been presented that look eerily similar when you really study them. And so that suggests that there are these universal values that humans have and have had across eras and cultures. And then there's also a lot of research that suggests that's very much true. Martin Seligman and Christopher Peterson have found what they've sort of broken up into 24 different virtues that are consistent across cultures and eras. We observe it in even the most sort of indigenous tribes, like our ancestors lived. And so that tells us that there are these sort of universal human ideals that we can strive to study and learn to embody. I also think that in some ways, our values are kind of like our genes or our fingerprints or something. They're pretty much the same. They're maybe 99% the same. They all pretty much look like fingerprints and not like volcanoes or something, but they're all slightly different. And so I think we all need to inquire into our own individual, idiosyncratic ideals to really get close. I think those differences do matter on an individual level, and we have to figure out what we value uniquely and how we can learn to embody them. I encourage people to study the people that they admire most in their lives, in philosophical history and in fictional material potentially, anything that you can identify an impulse of admiration in your own mind, that gives you a huge clue into who you need to become. And this is essentially the message of my new book, Become Who You Are. It's finding out who you are in the sense of what you most admire in other people and learning, how can I gradually become more like this? How can I build these psychological habits so I become the person I most admire?
I want to take you from the general to the specific, and I'll use one of your mindsight cards to get there. Of those human values that are universally accepted or admired across all cultures, how would you defend those if you met an alien who had a completely different perspective on reality and didn't have an understanding or give a rat's ass about human values? So how would you defend it? Which ones would you defend, and how would you do that?
That's a great question. I'll take it in a little bit different direction in that I really don't think I would have any basis for defending human values. I don't think they are objective in that sense. I don't think they apply to someone who doesn't have a human mind. And so there's really not much to say to that person. And you can take that in, disturbing directions too. There are people in this world who are sort of like aliens in that their minds are uniquely different. We have psychopaths who, at the very least, don't have the same drives that the rest of us do. I'm not necessarily convinced they don't have the same values, particularly when we study them, but it does lead to some difficult questions. But ultimately, the reason why we need to act in alignment with our own values is not because they're objectively good. It's because they are subjectively good. It's because we're evaluating ourselves according to that. And even if we aren't necessarily conscious of it, our mind is constantly observing our own behavior and asking, well, do I approve of myself or not? Am I approvable or not? And I've argued there are deep sort of evolutionary reasons why our brain is constantly doing this. But I think it has huge implications for our well-being. I think being a person that you yourself don't approve of has, huge psychological implications. It's the worst prison you can be in, essentially. So I think there are very real reasons why we should live according to our own values, but I don't think they apply to non-humans in the same way.
You're sitting here with me. Defend the values that you think are useful for humans. Again, let's get to the end state. What do we want to look like? What do we want to act like? Who do we want to be as a species?
I think there's a pretty wide range, and it's difficult to balance them all, but certainly we value pro-social ideals, things like kindness and fairness toward other human beings. I think that's one of the deepest, most deeply embedded virtues that humans have. I think we also value things like ingenuity, creativity, and humor. These are often left out of accounts of what a virtue is, but I don't think it should. It's clear that we admire people who have these traits, who are charismatic or funny, creative. So that's a big one. And that's also a huge one for me. I personally value ingenuity very highly. If I'm not exercising my ingenuity, I'm not really feeling like I'm in an optimal place in my life. We also have things like discipline. This is one of the reasons why I think exercise is such an effective sort of prescription for someone who's depressed, is that, exercise is something you can pretty much do no matter what life circumstances you have, and it gives you evidence of your own discipline and traits like this. So I think, I think there's just a really wide range of these virtues, and everyone has some that come more easily to them. I think you can tell in pretty early age that you have some strength that comes naturally to you. And I think a lot of us forget about those and think about more practical considerations as we get older and wonder why our life circumstances that we have achieved aren't bringing us, a deeper kind of satisfaction. And I think that's because we haven't integrated those virtues that we thrive at and that we value into our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Especially since COVID, mental health has become a real crisis around the world. There's a lot of anxiety, right? A lot of depression, right? A lot of suicide. So what do you think causes depression? And how can we architect or design our mind away from that or out of that?
Yeah, this is a deep question that I've done a really deep dive into pretty recently. I went through a sort of bout of depression myself, and it was kind of unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Before that, I sort of bought into the sort of typical assumptions that it's something that happens either when our lives just aren't good and we aren't getting our emotional needs met, or it's a chemical imbalance or something, which has been pretty widely believed. And when I actually experienced it, I said, there's something that doesn't add up about this. Why would this be preserved throughout our evolution? Why would this crippling state that seems to make us bad at everything and not want to do things, how could it have made it through millions of years of natural selection? And
that's a good question. I like that.
When you study it, you find, well, it doesn't look like a normal pathology. Normally pathologies get more common as people get older and their organs start deteriorating. We don't see this in depression. Most people experience their first bout of depression in early adulthood, if they experience it at all. And like 25% of us will experience it at some point in our lives. So that's really curious. We also observe it throughout every culture, same as those values, right? Even indigenous tribes and parts of the world very similar to our ancestors' environment experience depression too, and they describe it very similarly. I don't think they experience it to the same degree that we do, and that goes to the fact that we live in a world that is pretty different in a lot of ways from the one in which we evolved. And so conditions are different, the inputs going into our minds are different, and there are a lot of things that really serve to get us hooked and pull us away from those values in the modern world. Ultimately, here is my understanding of what really is the root cause of depression. I think that self-esteem is essentially built into our brains to simulate social esteem and to keep us in positive standing with our tribe. This has been proposed by Mark Leary in the sociometer theory of self-esteem. And that much is great. But I've connected this not only to these virtues that I've talked about and how we're essentially analyzing ourselves and evaluating ourselves according to these virtues so that we can know how approvable we are likely to be by our social tribe, right? But I've gone further to say this is not only a simulator running to give us information, but it's driving behavior and it's driving our mood and emotions, meaning our well-being actually goes up or down based on how approvable or admirable we deem ourselves to be. I've done a good bit of researching into the sort of neuroscience behind this, and I've connected it to things like the default mode network in the brain and our neurochemical like serotonin systems. And I've argued that essentially we get depressed when our self-esteem, which is sort of like a fuel gauge for social esteem, hits bottom. And essentially depression is that light that comes on that says the fuel is low, right? You can't keep functioning as you have been and going on like nothing's wrong. So when we aren't living according to these human values that we ourselves value, our brain is observing our behaviors and saying, no, you need to stop. You need to quit putting yourself out there. You need to quit doing all these things. You're going to get ostracized by your tribe, right? You're going to alienate all of your potential allies and mates, right? You can't keep doing this. And so it causes a set of moods and really a coordinated response across mood and cognition and physiology that causes you to withdraw, to shut down in many ways, and to become socially risk averse, to be very sensitive to things like social rejection, and essentially to re-strategize or give your brain the space to build a new identity strategy, essentially, because the path you've been pursuing hasn't been working. Now, of course, this doesn't necessarily always translate because we have sometimes distorted perceptions of ourselves. They aren't always clear, and we see this in a lot of depressed patients. They will believe that they are hopeless, unlovable, worthless, even if they're not, even if evidence sort of goes to the contrary. So I think it is possible for this mechanism in our brain to become distorted and to develop these wrong ideas. And this is where cognitive therapy and cognitive restructuring becomes really useful so that we can sort out these systems. But I also don't think it's always distorted. I think sometimes our view of ourselves is correct, and what's needed is a change in action and behavior and lifestyle. And that's where practices like behavioral activation come in. But you've covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah, I sure did. The simplest explanation is Buddha's explanation. He says Maya is dukkha. So the illusion that we are a separate entity, a separate body, is suffering. So you can say that the entire human arrangement is suffering. So it's just a matter of like clawing your way out of the suffering to find meaning. And you're suggesting that we architect that through alignment with these higher self, higher values. And that makes sense. And I agree with that. But I think ultimately the Buddha is right. It's like the only pure way to alleviate anxiety, depression, and that, human suffering is to stop identifying with a body as a separate, independent, existing self, because we're not. And this is a hard thing for most people to wrap their designing minds around because it's so far up from their actual experience of life.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I'm curious about your take on this because I do explore this concept pretty deeply in this new book.
Yeah, I thought so. With a title like that, you would have to, because, know thyself, or who am I, is the ultimate, jnana yoga, meditation practice. And as you contemplate the who am I question, you get to that conclusion that there is no independent, observable, identifiable, separate self in there. It's just a bunch of ideas. It's just a bunch of concepts, but built upon flawed memories and flawed ideas. So that's that. The training has been happening to you since birth, and most people don't take the time to begin to understand their mind and to redesign it. You have this really, really flawed operating system, which is, it's like a jalopy held together with rigorous tape and Band-Aids.
Right.
And you call that me, and it's not working very well. And so,
yeah,
it's a mess.
Yeah. So my view on this is that first, you're absolutely right. The Buddha is absolutely right. The self is not a coherent construct, right? If you really examine it, that concept kind of falls apart.
However, it's useful.
Right.
It exists so that we can get by in the world. So it's a both and.
Yeah. So my view is that, so if you imagine that depression is a -1 on a scale from -1 to 1, so that you have a strong sense of self and it's a very negative sense of self, right? You're constantly ruminating about how worthless and unlovable you are, right? That's what we see in severe depressed patients, right? So my view is that you can sort of transcend your sense of self and eliminate that negativity. And that's what the Buddha talks about. That's what people like Eckhart Tolle have written about. Essentially, they couldn't live with themselves. They had this awakening experience, and then they had no self. And it was much better than having this awful sense of self. I've argued, and it's a bit of an unconventional take, but it's that this is essentially 0 on the scale. We have no strong sense of self at all, not negative, not positive. And so we've completely transcended all selfhood. Well, the self, if my arguments in this book are correct, the self is there for a reason, and it's there to regulate, in many ways, our well-being. Self-esteem exists to determine how much sort of happy chemicals and corresponding happy behaviors to give us. And if that's the case, then transcending the self is like taking the batteries out of the happiness, unhappiness machine entirely. We stop ruminating over ourselves, but we also stop experiencing the positive feelings that come along with having a sense of self. The pride and the joy and what the Stoics and the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia. So my argument is that, yes, if you are depressed, it may be beneficial to transcend your sense of self. That'll be much better than having this very negative sense of self. But ultimately, we can use our sense of self while simultaneously recognizing that it's an illusion, it's a game, it's not ultimately real, to build a deeper sense of well-being and eudaimonia, and actually preserve that sense of self and, develop actual admiration for ourselves so that we, justified admiration, right, for living according to our values. But that way, when we have self-related thoughts, they're mostly positive. They're mostly self-approving. And that's a really positive thing. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, the best times in my life have been the times when I did have a strong, positive sense of self. I was living according to my ideals, and I was noticing it, and I was proud of that. It's better than the times that I've been kind of transcended my sense of self. I kind of didn't have a sense of self, because I've done a good bit of meditation at this point too, and at some points strived for that goal of de-selfifying. But ultimately, I've decided it's better for me, at least, to use meditation as a tool to sort of step back, get distance, and go in and design a better mind and a better self, and then go back in and enjoy having that sense of self, rather than just backing away further and further to the point of losing it entirely.
It's interesting. You talk about backing away as if, and this is a common mistake with self-awareness and meditation, it can lead to detachment. That's an error, right? A forced error, so to speak, caused to this, the ego basically saying, I'm going to be detached. I'm not going to feel the sense of self. And so then you tend to withdraw from the world. So that's a pathological practice of meditation. It's not effective. This is why in historical context, there was a teacher, a guru, who was important, because they could prevent students from sliding into that problem trap. I like your little scale. So I would say that if -1 is self-loathing and depression, then +1 is narcissism. It's a super aggrandized sense of self where that is the center of everything. So I believe it is actually extraordinarily valuable to transcend the self, but you don't lose the self in that. It becomes nested within a much bigger, much more expansive concept of the who I am principle, which becomes non-personal but inclusive of the personal. And in that, you can liken the range. Let's say if you're -1 to 1 is the range of the personality, and that's fine. Everyone who maintains an ego is going to have, some ones, right? Some aspects of oneness, right? Where they feel, strong in that ego sense. But the range then, through self-awareness and like the Zen concept of taming the ego, which is that sense of self we're talking about, suddenly becomes much more expansive. So it's like from -1 to 1,000.
Right.
And so you don't lose the capacity to feel bliss, joy, happiness. It's actually greatly expanded. Again, this is what Buddha was talking about. Maya, the illusion that you are an independent, separate self, separate from everything else, is suffering. So how do you transcend that? You transcend Maya, which means you take the illusion, right, and you dissolve the illusion.
Right.
How do you dissolve the illusion? You turn toward what's real, which is the ineffable. So it's not saying that you're wrong. It's saying that actually your idea can be nested within the wisdom tradition's idea of awakening and still work. Because within that, it still makes a lot of sense to architect the egoic structures for more effective living.
Yeah.
Even as an enlightened, even if you had a spontaneous awakening like Eckhart Tolle, it took him many years to redesign his mind to be able to function appropriately in the world. And Dr. David Hawkins talks about the same thing. And upon his awakening experience, it took him years. Most awakened beings go into seclusion or they never return. And so, I think this is actually a good conversation to have because there's so much spiritual language around awakening in these days. And everyone thinks awakening is just an experience. And, I had an awakening experience because I did some ayahuasca and it was awesome. It was beautiful, right? I'm at one with everything. And it's actually strengthening their ego, right? Because awakening is not an experience. It's popping out of all experience whatsoever.
Yeah.
Anyways, I know I went down a little rabbit hole there, but I'm also passionate about understanding the mind. And from the perspective of awakening, you actually don't have a mind. Mind happens, right? The body is an instrument for consciousness to flow through it, and the flowing through that consciousness meeting the brain activates the brain structures, and it creates the mind that we think of as ours.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think we're ultimately saying the same thing because I do think it's become very common to interpret these Eastern teachings as you should lose your sense of self entirely. And like you say, that's not ultimately the end goal.
You're just not impressed by it.
Right.
Right? You just don't believe it, all the stories.
Yeah, yeah.
The analogy of a burnt rope, something that Ramana Maharshi used, he said from the enlightened, awakened perspective, the ego or the mind is like a burnt rope, like those big ropes you use, for like CrossFit gym climbing or on a farm. If it endures a fire and you go like poke around in the remnants of the fire, you can see the rope coiled up and it looks like the rope survived the fire, but you can pass your hand right through it. Right. And so the ego structures become like that. Some of the patterns remain. The individual, you, will still act like you, but you're just not convinced by it. Right. You know that it's just a bunch of algorithms and patterns and whatnot. And so you take it as it comes. And that's the idea of non-attachment, which is different than detachment, right? So you become very curiously non-attached to the workings of the mind. And if you decide you want to improve it for a better experience, you go improve it for a better experience. And that becomes much easier with the awareness.
Yeah, no, and I like what you said too about Eckhart Tolle, taking years to relearn how to function, because I literally talk about him in this chapter and say, I think he lost his self and then he found it again. He reconstructed it. Yeah, he has a functioning sense of self. He probably experiences much of what, I talk about as eudaimonia now. And so I guess what I'm doing in many ways in this is arguing against this misconception that you shouldn't have a functional sense of self. So I think we agree on that much.
I want to get to your new book, but let's talk a bit about like some of the core principles of designing the mind. Like, someone's just curious. They've heard us kind of ramble on now for a while, but they're asking them, hey, Mark, get into like, how do we design the mind? Like what's step 1 and 2 and 3?
Right. Well, first of all, it's funny we're talking about this stuff and step 1, because I present metacognition and mindfulness as essentially a prerequisite step to all of this. Yeah, you can't repair your glasses without taking them off and examining them. And so I do think we need to develop the capacity to examine what's going on in our own minds instead of just being caught up in the chaos of it all.
Let's define those terms. Mm-hmm. I have an idea of what they are, so I'd love to hear yours. Metacognition and mindfulness.
Yeah, metacognition is thinking about thinking, essentially. It's examining our own field of awareness and consciousness, getting to where we can say, oh, I'm having this thought, I'm having this emotion. Personally, I've actually argued that mindfulness is a conflation of several different ideas, and in some ways I find metacognition to be a little bit more coherent and easier to conceptualize, you might say, but essentially I see them as very close. I think mindfulness is a practice of metacognition, And meditation is a specific way to engage in that practice.
I would make a distinction. Metacognition is thinking about your thinking, right? So like journaling, reflecting upon behaviors, reflecting upon thought processes, tracing thoughts to their roots, and tracing triggers, reactionary behavior to its trigger, understanding the self. Metacognition is extremely valuable. Mindfulness is watching the thinking. It's not thinking about it.
Yeah.
So mindfulness is, when done well, and it's really not taught very well in the Western world. It hasn't been like transported over here very effectively, is developing the witnessing capacity.
Yeah.
And witnessing is from awareness. So awareness of the functioning of the mind is different than thinking. And so you become aware that thinking is happening, but you're not the thought. And so this is the beginning. It's a watershed moment in your own development when you begin to identify with thoughts as opposed to as thoughts.
Yeah.
And that's witnessing. So I think mindfulness is a very powerful practice for that.
They certainly can be treated as one thing. They often are in like metacognitive therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, but I think it makes sense, and I like the distinction of just witnessing versus actually thinking about the thinking. And I think the thinking about the thinking part is potentially a little underemphasized in a lot of mindfulness teachings. I think,
again, without the teacher, without some support, i.e. your book, they're closed loops.
Yeah.
And so you end up chasing your tail, chasing your mental tail. You end up back in the same, and that's the default mode network. You try thinking about your thinking, you end up back at the same place all the time.
Yep.
60,000 thoughts a day, 80% the same as yesterday. So it's a trap.
Yeah, I'm with you there. But then, this whole psychitecture thing emerges out of this metacognition. And I think after we develop that awareness, there's more to do. We don't just develop more awareness. We can go in and actually, precision change some of these bad habits of the mind. And so
the first step after that, step 2, is to identify what needs to be changed.
Right. Logging is a huge component of this. This is one of the practices of cognitive therapy that I think everyone should be doing. It should be taught first in school, essentially. Of writing down when you have a bad mood and what was the thought that you were having prior to that, right? What triggered that negative mood? And as you start logging this thing down, you might find within a week, 80% of your negative moods are essentially caused by one particular type of thought or belief that keeps popping up in your mind. And that gives you a huge opportunity to go in and change that. I mean, just realizing that is like half the battle already. Just noticing this type of thought is putting me into a bad mood and a negative sort of spiral on a regular basis. That's huge. But then you can go in and actually change that. And so I break up this process into 3 sort of realms that, of course, are all intertwined. But you've got the cognitive, the emotional, and the behavioral. And so I start the book in the cognitive realm, looking at cognitive biases and distortions, and saying, how do we actually change them once we notice them? Going through a lot of the most common biases and fallacies that we've observed, and why they're mistaken, and how you can sometimes go in and revise them. And then it really, to me, gets most interesting when we start looking at how those biases and distortions cause all these different moods, and how we can go in and alter them using psychotechnologies, essentially changing those negative algorithms into positive algorithms.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the process would be similar for emotions. Are there emotional biases just similar to cognitive biases?
That's how I understand it. Essentially, we've got a whole collection of cognitive biases, and some have a very significant implications for our moods and emotions, particularly when they are fallacies that relate to ourselves. In Feeling Good, a fantastic book for people who are struggling with depression, self-esteem, he breaks down 10 different distortions that he observes in depressed patients that have been observed a million times. Things like black and white thinking. Things like you miss an appointment and you say, "I always do this. I'm always missing appointments. I can't do anything right." Well, there's a whole gradient there. There's a whole degree. How many of your appointments do you successfully make it to? The majority, but I missed this one. So going in and recognizing that whole range and saying, no, actually, you should say you're like 95% good at making it to your appointments. You're not worthless and incompetent. So going through each of those, identifying which ones are affecting you and sort of learning how to replace them with alternative balance beliefs. Absolutely invaluable skill. Everyone should be doing this.
Once we identify the big rocks, the big cognitive emotional biases and behaviors that need to be changed, now what?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of opportunity for positive growth. Some of this is sort of framed around find the negative thing. And that's a big part of what the new book is centered around. It's going beyond examining negative sort of micro habits that are affecting you and saying, how can you really grow? How can you become the best version of yourself and the self that you admire most? And so that is a big part of what I put forward and recommend for just growing and going beyond that. There's a practice known as behavioral activation that I mentioned. And, this is a really stupid simple practice that's easy to overlook, but it performs better than any antidepressant. And that is literally just building an activity schedule for yourself that is slightly more challenging, slightly more fulfilling, brings slightly more pleasure or mastery into your life than you were doing before. And essentially incrementally increasing that until you're living more and more according to your values and you've climbed out of this vicious cycle that is depression. But I argue in that book too that behavioral activation and becoming who you are essentially one thing. We call it behavioral activation when it's on the very bottom, when you are, very depressed and you're not taking any behaviors that make you proud of who you are. But at the highest level, it's essentially the same thing. It's just doing it in a way that promotes deep flourishing and going beyond just regular, contentedness or happiness. And
at the base level, we call it healing. At the higher level, we call it peak performance.
Exactly.
Activation. Yeah.
Exactly.
Same principles, just applied at a different scale.
Completely. And I think as you go up that scale, it becomes more and more idiosyncratic. At the bottom of the scale, you can say just getting out of bed and taking a shower each day is going to give you, some reason to approve of yourself, right? Going on a walk, exercising, reading, that takes you a little higher. And then as you get up towards the top, you have to start asking, what vessel can I design for 7 of my top unique strengths where I can bring them all together into one place? And if you do that, it's not going to look like anything anyone else is really doing.
Right.
Because
that becomes the morning ritual, which combines journaling, meditation, the sauna, the cold plunge.
Yeah. And for
and a
me,
CrossFit workout.
For me, I see it as, designing the mind. I've essentially built this vessel for myself that brings everything I'm good at and interested in into one place. I'm bringing more of my personal virtues out through this than I've ever been able to do through anything else in my life. So it's extremely fulfilling because it does give me this unique opportunity to do what I'm good at every day.
Mm-hmm. That idea of who we are, right? It's, again, if it's just left up to the ego and social construct, then we have often a false sense of who we are.
Yeah. So
how do we find out who we really are? And what I mean by that, I don't mean the one with everything. I mean, what is our purpose and how do we uncover our purpose on this planet and our reason for being here, reason for existing?
Yeah, so become who you are is actually a phrase that Nietzsche originally said, and he's always nice and cryptic, so it's taken a lot of studying his work to be able to make some sense of that. But what I've sort of found, the more I've studied him, is that he's essentially talking about discovering our deepest, unique personal virtues, and essentially exactly what we're talking about here, learning how to bring them into yourself, into your life. He was really critical of people who treat pleasure and comfort like they're the ultimate end goal in life.
That's the hedonistic approach.
Right, yeah. And this is one of the few areas where Nietzsche and the Stoics and all these thinkers that, and Nietzsche is very critical of pretty much everyone, but where they all converge and essentially say, no, you're aiming for the wrong thing. It's not about comfort and pleasure and hedonism. It's about character and cultivating your personal strengths, even if it's painful and uncomfortable and difficult.
Don't you think character and virtues, they're different than purpose? They can point toward purpose. Yeah. Or you could say another way, if a purpose is, let's say, to be a warrior, then you're going to possess and share certain warrior virtues that other warriors would share. And that's what makes, that's what makes the definition of a warrior come alive for you. So back to the question, like, how do we figure out who we are in terms of our purpose, our calling?
Yeah. So this is another area where I have maybe a little bit of a different take. I argue in the first chapter of this new book that meaning and purpose could be a bit of a red herring in terms of what the ultimate good is to be pursuing. I think this has become very common to say, oh, it's not about pleasure and comfort. It's not about hedonism. It's about meaning. And you sort of have this, I call it a philosophical mystery meat, where it's like, what is meaning? What is purpose? Do we know what meaning means? Right. And I've done some thought experiments where I say, okay, well, when I was in college, I was really happy. That was a great time for me. But I didn't have a clear sense of meaning or purpose. I was figuring out my worldview. It was very much up in the air as I was sort of transitioning away from Christianity and toward my own sort of philosophical worldview. I didn't know what I wanted to do in the world yet, but that was a really good time. And similarly, I can imagine the opposite. I can imagine I'm doing something that's very purposeful. It's doing something good for the world, but it's not something I'm particularly good at. Maybe I'm doing like accounting for a charity and I'm very much not a numbers guy. And I can imagine being pretty unhappy despite doing something very purposeful. And so what I argue is that virtue is a better thing to pay attention to. They may overlap a good bit. They probably will. But if you're looking for a North Star, asking, what are my highest strengths? How can I bring them out in my life? And if you aim for that, you will end up designing a life that must be fulfilling. If I'm right in my assumptions about how this mechanism works in our minds. For me, the fact that I'm doing something purposeful, the fact that I'm improving people's lives, and then I get messages from people saying, wow, this book changed my life, that is really great. That's awesome. In some ways, it's like the cherry on top of the sundae, though, because just doing what I'm good at, just bringing my strengths of wisdom and ingenuity and all these other things together in one place, that is really the sundae. That's most of what makes it enjoyable for me.
That's awesome.
So those values to me, the things that we most admire in others, to me, that's the ultimate North Star. But yeah, in some ways it is a little different from the conventional sort of purpose and meaning.
Yeah. No, actually, I really like your explanation there, and it kind of jives with my experience. Work that I do with clients, we do a process we call the 3 Ps, which is to identify or clarify your principles. So these virtues you're talking about, your passions, and your purpose. And what I find is maybe just like 20% have clarity on their purpose or even find it quickly. It's very rare. So most have to go down the path of really identifying and aligning with their passions and their principles. And through that process, the meaning is found often in the work that they're doing. Yeah. Or they uncover this idea that, wow, I really value these things and I'm really passionate about these things. So I can point in that direction to have, to find this purpose, and then they're able to articulate a purpose. So they kind of back into it that way, which is really kind of what you just said. So it's insightful.
Yeah. I built a, program that sort of goes along with Become Who You Are, called the Flourishing Function. It's sort of meant to take you from potentially anywhere from being depressed to, the highest levels of flourishing, wherever you're starting at. And once you get to the higher levels in the later modules, it does start looking at that ikigai notion of where what you're good at and what you love and what the world needs all sort of converge. That's what it looks like when you build a sort of virtue domain for yourself where you do have the ability to bring all these things together. So I think that is the goal, and it is remarkably rare. I mean, I'm honestly pleased to hear the 20% have that clarity, because I rarely meet people who have really found that sense of purpose where all those things come together.
Well, I think listeners can be comforted to know that one of my teachers, a guy named Maharaj, he's no longer alive, of course, says the purpose of life is living.
Yeah.
So live well and be who you are. And being who you are is living well, right? Or becoming who you are is living well.
Yep, I very much agree with that.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, this is Mark Devine, founder of SealFit and Unbeatable Mind, and I'm super stoked to announce that
My new book, Uncommon, is due out from St. Martin's Press this summer, July 16th. And we've launched a pre-order campaign. You can learn more about that at readuncommon.com to try to get early awareness for the book, which I hope will help a lot of people, where I go and do a deep dive on the 5 mountains of personal mastery: physical, mental, emotional, intuitional, and spiritual. Uncommon, simple principles for an extraordinary life. Check it out at readuncommon.com, and thank you for your support and being part of the change that you want to see in this world. Hoo-yah, divine out. Ryan, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your time here today. So thank you again for making the trip in person. It meant a lot to us, and it's going to help a lot of people. So thanks you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Great conversation.
Hoo-yah.